ballroom, I would like to welcome you to the forum on behalf of the Public Law Center, Research Center, and Center for Jurisprudence and Human Rights. Our topic today is refugee. And I'm sure that you all remember in 2015, the photo of a drunk kid on the beach shocked the world and stirred public concern about the refugee crisis. Since then, the situation has worsened rather than improved. Photos of children separated from their parents in U.S. border custody, living in camps at U.S. borders, became one of the most terrifying things after Trump assumed office. Indeed, people move across borders for various reasons, and some of them are forced to move due to political suppression, gender oppression, economic difficulty, and climate change. So we really do have to think about the legal and moral responsibility that rich countries in the global north have. So these countries, which have benefited tremendously from the economic exploitation of the global south, has a legal and moral responsibility to accept refugees. And what about a country like Taiwan, which is constantly under military threat from China and not recognized as a country by the UN? Do we have the same moral and legal responsibility to accept refugees, including refugees from China, the enemy state? How do we balance between protecting refugee rights and fulfilling a country's responsibility to accept refugees and national security? I think these are the questions that we will be discussing today, and we have three excellent experts on this issue. Our first speaker, Professor Camilo Peréz-Bustillo, is visiting professor at the National Taiwan University College of Law. He is co-founder, witness at the border.org and International Tribunal of Conscious Peoples in Movement. Then Professor Bustillo will be our first speaker. And we have two discussants followed by Professor Peréz-Bustillo. And our first discussant is Eeling. Eeling is an activist and executive director of Amnesty International Taiwan. She was executive director of Taiwan Association for Human Rights, Chengchi. She has devoted herself to the advocacy of immigration and refugee rights for decades. So we really look forward to her comments and presentation. And our second discussant is Professor Vivianne. Professor Ong is Associate Professor at the Department of Political Science at National Chengchi University. She received her PhD in International Public Law in France and is an expert in international human rights. So we really look forward to her comments on Professor Peréz-Bustillo's presentation. So now let's welcome Professor Peréz-Bustillo for his presentation.
Thank you. I'm not sure if this is working.
You have to turn on the mic.
Hello. Does this work? Sorry. I'm not sure what I need to do now. Yeah.
Okay. Step one. Then you let me know.
Thank you. I want to welcome everybody. I'm really honored to be accompanied by the two professors, by our hosts here at NTU, by Professor Weng, and also by Amnesty International through our colleague named Chiu. And I'm really here to learn from them. I want to share as much as I can. Time is always the enemy. I think after everything that we've just heard from Professor Chen, I think we have an idea of what's at stake, and that's really what I want to share with you. I want to also add something that's more improvised, not really included in detail in my presentation, which is everything that Professor Chen just described at the US-Mexico border, which is where I've done much of my work, is getting worse as we speak. I was up most of the night because there's a new policy, actually it's an old policy that's being reinstated, a policy that was originally imposed by the Trump administration in 2018 and 2019 that essentially sends asylum seekers into exile on Mexican territory, essentially transforms Mexico into what's called, in quotes, a safe third country. And this is, of course, a typical mechanism that we've seen not only at that border, but at borders throughout the world. We see that in Europe, we see that at the periphery in the Mediterranean, we're seeing it now in the English Channel between France and the UK, we saw it at the borders between Poland and Belarus, and it is what has characterized Australia's policies towards the region here, closer to us. So one of my main messages is, as we speak, this policy is being prepared for reinstatement on Monday. That's why we were busy trying to respond last night. And this morning, I can share some of that with you in the dialogue. But as we speak, that is happening. And it is that policy of not permitting asylum seekers to enter US territory, of forcing them to remain in dangerous, precarious conditions without humanitarian assistance and support on Mexican territory, which produced those refugee camps that Professor Chen described. My work in 2017, 2018, 2019 was precisely in that context up to the beginning of 2020. A few months before I came here, we were working directly with the camp that was the product of these policies at a crossing between US-Mexico, in the US-Mexico border region. That's Brownsville on the Texas side and Matamoros on the US side, for those of you who might know the map a little bit of Texas and so on. So my thoughts this afternoon are with those migrants who once again are being plunged into that context. And I think that's the place to begin. That's why one of the frameworks I want to share with you is this concept of migrant genocide. And what I want to pose to you is a question about the relationship that should be assumed between mass human rights crimes against migrants. And we'll talk about the terminology in a moment, but when I say migrants, I include refugees, displaced persons, asylum seekers, exiles, persons in movement, but that we also refer to as peoples in movement, because one of the first things that I want to affirm in this presentation is that we're talking about collective subjects of transnational rights. Rights which transcend borders, and rights that should be affirmed independently of borders. That's the perspective I want to share with you, which comes from the work of social movements around the world, of migrant movements specifically, who are formulating these demands in various different contexts with varying different forms throughout the world at the same time. So, the first thing is this integral approach to the subjects of rights, not objects, subjects of rights, and to look at them as, in Spanish we say, pueblos en movimiento. We can say personas en movimiento, persons in movement, which is increasingly the terminology that's used in this context, but we also want to affirm that we're not just speaking of persons with individual rights, but of sectors that have internationally recognized collective rights. That's why a key bridge, and what I want to share with you, is between migrants and indigenous peoples. Because migrants and indigenous peoples, I want to argue, both among the sectors most universally marginalized from human rights protections in the world, and we can talk more about that. Simply, if we look at the international system, who is protected and who is not, who is at the core and who is at the margins, who is literally and metaphorically at the borders of human rights, conceptually and practically. So the fact that in Latin America, and of course this is true at the periphery of Europe as well, that many of those who we would designate as migrants broadly are also persons who have collective rights that need to be recognized. So this is true not just in the US, Latin America context, but around the world. The other point of departure for this is that when we speak of mass human rights crimes against those sectors throughout the world, what we're speaking is of the kinds of crimes that trigger duties on states that are what we normally refer to as the framework of transitional justice. So the bridge is between migrants and these other sectors that have collective rights on the one hand, but it's also between the human rights crimes that they are victims of, objects of, and their rights to transitional justice, because what we're talking about is a combination of structural violence and of state violence. In the face of that, what we affirm is that the place where we should begin is not with the nation state, because these are rights that transcend states and that cannot be trampled by them, but that the specific right that we're talking about that needs to be affirmed is the right to freedom of movement itself. Yeah. The right to freedom of movement itself, which is also referred to as the right to human mobility or the right to migrate. In Latin, it's described as jus migrandi, and it was first formulated in the 16th century at the School of Salamanca by one of the key founders of international law as a discipline, which is Francisco de Vitoria, who basically was the inspiration and the teacher for Grotius. Notice when we speak of international law, and we speak of the origins of international law, this issue of the right to migrate was positioned from the beginning at those origins. From him comes that concept of jus migrandi, and this is what eventually we find in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Article 13, in the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights in Articles 12 and 13, and what later the International Court of Justice takes as one of the bases for its decision in the advisory opinion regarding the legality of the wall erected by Israel on Palestinian-occupied territory, the Israeli wall case in 2004. So we go from the 16th century, jus migrandi, all the way into the 21st century in terms of that guiding thread. It's along that path that we get the leading instrument in terms of the definition of the rights of migrant workers, defined in those terms, migrant workers and members of their families, what's generally referred to as CMW because of the committee that oversees it, which was adopted in 1990, entered into force in 2003, and which we can talk about as a framework. In terms of dates, as we meet today, and I'm thinking of what's going on at the border, a few other dates that we should have in mind. Of course, December 10th, International Human Rights Day, which will shortly be observed, and which this forum, in part, is trying to sort of initiate reflection with regard to. December 18th is International Migrants Day, which precisely marks the moment when the Migrant Convention was adopted. We just observed on November 25th the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, as was emphasized by Professor Chen, an absolutely critical issue here. This is one of those sectors that has not just individual rights, but collective rights when we're speaking about peoples in movement as collective transnational subjects, women, indigenous peoples, groups that have collective rights. But also, we have 2 dates coming up that I want to remember especially, that reflect the nature of the mass human rights crimes that are the texture, the embodiment of what we're talking about in more theoretical terms, perhaps, which is on December 8th and December 24th, we're marking the 3rd anniversary of the death in custody under the supervision of the Border Patrol in the US, on US territory at the border, of 2 indigenous migrant children, Jacqueline Calmaquin on December 8th, 7 years old, and Felipe Gomez Alonso, 8 years old, who died on Christmas Eve, December 24th, in the custody of the Border Patrol because their medical needs were not adequately addressed, because the Border Patrol let them die. And so that's how we get to the nature of the mass human rights crimes that are at issue, and the fact that they rise to the level of crimes against humanity. They shock our conscience to such a degree that they rise to the level of crimes against humanity, which trigger duties of transitional justice. Normally, when we speak of transitional justice, we do not think of these sectors as subjects of those processes. One of my main purposes today is to suggest to you that we need to rethink the framework of transitional justice to incorporate this sector as subjects of those processes. So even, for example, in Taiwan, as we think about the ongoing process, which is still unfolding, which is still not completed, of transitional justice, one of the questions should be, just as we ask, and as indigenous movements in Taiwan ask, about what is the place for them at the table of transitional justice? What about the crimes against indigenous peoples during the White Terror and martial law, but also before, under Japanese colonialism, or previously, or currently? We also have to ask, what is the place that migrant workers should have, and migrant communities in Taiwan as transitional justice continues to unfold? So that's another of the questions. The way to sum this up, in essence, I mean, you've had this on the screen, is something that is not only reflected in the instruments of international law that I mentioned, but also is beginning to be reflected in domestic law. I would argue that one of the great contributions of what is developing in Latin America in terms of the new horizons of human rights law that I want to share with you is what's happening in terms of constitutional reform. Obviously, we have Chile, which is a very important ongoing case, nationally and regionally and internationally. We already had in Ecuador a similar process, a constituent assembly that produced one of the most advanced constitutions in the world that was approved in 2006, and which in Articles 40, 41, and 42 specifically recognizes the right to migrate and the right to refuge, asylum, and sanctuary, using those words, refuge, asylum, and sanctuary, and also the right not to be arbitrarily displaced. And so one of my arguments would be that when we think of jus migrandi today, when we think of where the law has been and where it's going and where it needs to be, we need to look at the contributions, for example, of constitutional instruments and human rights advances like those of Ecuador. One of the reasons we need to do that, and this is for those of us who like to be more technical about these things, we're talking about the sources of international law. Where does international law come from? And specifically what I'm alluding to is Article 38 of the statute of the International Court of Justice of the ICJ, which of course is an annex to the UN Charter, is an international binding treaty on all the members of the international community, not just those that are state parties or members of the UN, but all of the international community through customary law. And that specifically provides that one of the key sources of international law, both for international tribunals and for national tribunals, which have a very important role in all of this, is precisely constitutional provisions such as Articles 40 to 42, inequality. Yeah, so that's sort of the architecture of the argument that I think we should have in mind. I'll set aside for the moment what UN Secretary General has referred to, I allude to here, as travel apartheid in the last few days. In addition to the developments at the US-Mexico border, we have, as everyone knows, this global scare about Omicron, which is of course real, and about COVID, which is of course real, but we also have all of the arbitrary and unjust ways in which that is being responded to. The immediate imposition of the travel bans, primarily on the countries of Southern Africa, on South Africa itself, where the variant was discovered, but it's not a, quote, South African variant, as it's been mistakenly called by some, just as the virus is not a China virus, as so many have referred to. And so that's why Antonio Guterres of the UN, who's somebody who knows about these issues, he's former head of UNHCR. He's the first UN Secretary General who's actually an expert in refugee and migrant law and international humanitarian law. He called those measures adopted by President Biden in the US. At the same time as he was reinstating the criminal policy at the border, he imposed what Guterres referred to as travel apartheid. Not surprisingly, since the first country it was applied to was South Africa itself. So the historical ironies are extraordinary. What are we talking about in sum? This is the conclusion at the end of this slide. The demand of migrant movements around the world and their allies, and those of us who accompany them, is in sum all rights for all without borders. And it's grounded in an understanding of these issues and of these processes of global migration as a contemporary form of decolonization. So decolonial thinking, a decolonial framework, a decolonial perspective is absolutely crucial and central when we talk about these issues. So this is the framework of peoples in movement. In essence, this is what Walter Benjamin was writing about in his theses on the philosophy of history in 1940, when he was trapped as a displaced exile, deprived of his citizenship in Germany because of his Jewish identity, at the borders between France and Spain, denied entry to Spain, denied an exit visa from France, and he wrote about these issues in the theses on the philosophy of history. And what he said more or less is as follows: the traditions of the oppressed teach us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception, but the rule. This is what Giorgio Agamben has written about in his book, States of Emergency. This is what Hannah Arendt built upon, who was one of the most important people to sort of keep alive the memory of Benjamin in the interwar period. What they wrote about was the need to recognize that the nascent system of universal human rights that we celebrate December 10th through the adoption of the anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was born incomplete because it tied rights to status of citizenship and membership in existing nation states. And by definition, denied rights to those who did not have that citizenship and that protection. This is what Hannah Arendt wrote about, building on Walter Benjamin, and that Giorgio Agamben later developed. This is what Hannah Arendt wrote about in her chapter, The Perplexities of Human Rights, written in 1951, with her early reflections about the limits and the implications of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What do we confront from that perspective? We confront the imposition globally of this overall migration policy paradigm, which means at every major border of the world, in the Western Hemisphere, in Europe and Africa and the Middle East, in Asia and the Pacific, the imposition of national security frameworks on migration policy, what's referred to as securitization, which was in fact first tested in the European Union and then further developed in much more detail in the US. It means the militarization of borders, the criminalization of migrants through, for example, the governing doctrine of the US Border Patrol today, the same Border Patrol that killed the indigenous children, Jacqueline and Felipe, in custody. It means what they call prevention through deterrence. Prevention through deterrence means make the journey as difficult as possible, make it as dangerous as possible along the most precarious routes for the most vulnerable sectors, and try to make them suffer. That is the nature of contemporary migration policy around the world. That's what they call prevention through deterrence. It's the criminalization of migrants and the criminalization of border communities. It also means their transformation into things, thingification, commodification, as has been written about, which means the increased exploitation of migrant labor, higher profits for human smugglers and traffickers. The best friends of the human smuggling and trafficking networks around the world are governments who adopt these policies. Because what they do is create tremendous incentives to smugglers and traffickers, because if legal migration is made impossible, the only alternative is these irregular routes that they seek to repress. But at the same time, it's this contradiction, because we saw all of this rhetoric in the context of COVID and the pandemic about essential workers, right? About all of the workers who were absolutely crucial during the pandemic to maintain social life, but at the same time to intensify their exploitation. At the same time, which means that we, as peoples in movements, are both necessary and disposable at the same time. That's what commodification is about. All of this is conducted through mechanisms that we have come to understand through the theoretical frameworks of migration study that are referred to as externalization, outsourcing or gatekeeping, and regionalization. This is what the US is doing with Mexico through the policies I described at the beginning, that will be reinstated beginning Monday, which they call, by the way, this is the cynicism of governments like Biden's, and of course Trump's. I mean, Trump was even worse, but Biden is no better on this issue, what they call the Migrant Protection Protocols. Right? In the names of migrant protection, make their life as difficult as possible. Externalization means what the US is doing with Mexico and with the countries of origin throughout Central America to try and contain and repress migrant flows, but it is of course what the EU is doing actively as we speak through Frontex and through bilateral and multilateral agreements with Morocco, with Libya, with Turkey, and so on. And it's what's at stake in whatever evolves between France and UK in terms of the situation in the English Channel, and whatever develops at Poland and Belarus. This is the outsourcing or gatekeeping. This is, for example, the EU financing in Libya secret prisons where over 6,000 migrants are currently held in conditions analogous to slavery through EU financing and support. But because it's on Libyan territory, out of sight, out of mind. This is what outsourcing, gatekeeping, externalization means. And regionalization means is you turn that into the policy not just bilaterally, but multilaterally in the region where these countries are located. All of this is being imposed globally through what's called global migration governance, another euphemism, kind of like migrant protection protocols, global migration governance through entities like the Global Forum on Migration and Development, and through what are called the Global Compacts on Migration and Refuge. Now, I'm not speaking theoretically when I talk about this. I was in Marrakesh, Morocco, in December 2018 when the Global Compact was adopted. I was at the Global Forum on Migration and Development as a civil society delegate at 6 different occasions between 2006 and 2018 when all of this was developed. I saw this, I heard it with my own eyes. So in sum, going back to Benjamin, going back to Hannah Arendt, going back to George Agamben, to be migrant, to be indigenous in today's world is to live in that permanent state of emergency. Here we don't need to linger, but just let's look at it for a moment. What did I say at the beginning? What I suggested at the beginning about migrants and indigenous peoples at the margins of global human rights. Simply look at this chart, and we can again share it in detail later, of the number of state parties for each important instrument and which instrument has how many. No? So this is how we define the core of the global human rights system, the 9 core instruments, and I added the Genocide Convention, I think it should be included. And I added ILO Convention 169 because indigenous people are so marginalized that there is not even a convention as to indigenous rights. There's a declaration, and those of us who are lawyers know that there's an important difference in terms of enforceability and standing between a convention and a declaration. But ILO Convention 169 is the leading instrument to which states can adhere. What we can say is this, quickly, is from the Convention on the Rights of the Child at the top and CEDAW. They are, let's say, the good news, supposedly the global consensus, although we know today, as the rights of women are cut back, likely by the US Supreme Court based on the argument yesterday and the argument last month, we know what that really means in practice. Supposedly there's a global consensus in favor of women's rights, but what does that mean in practice? So even if supposedly you're at the top of the hierarchy, that doesn't mean you're necessarily meaningfully protected. But what is clear is if you're bottom at the hierarchy, you are the most marginalized and the most vulnerable. And so the Convention on Migrant Workers, CMW, 56 state parties, take a look at the website for the CMW, and what you will find, that it's not surprising, is that of the 56 states, 55 are states of origin, not receiving states. So it's a theoretical exercise. I mean, of course, they're seeking to protect their citizens, but it is not the receiving states which are whom we must exact these commitments from, as Professor Chen shared with us. An ILO convention, I mean, I won't say it's a joke, but it's certainly an outrage. It only has 24 state parties. And primarily, these are states that have large numbers of indigenous people. So again, it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So let's come back to this. I mean, this is simply for us to think about the architecture of the international system, who it protects and who it excludes, and how that works. So that's why we talk about migrant genocide, and that's why we talk about the relationship between migrant genocide and transitional justice. Essentially what we're saying is contemporary global migration policy, in the context I've tried to share with you, is essentially a machinery of death, of suffering, and of exclusion. This is what Upendra Bakshi has written about, the extraordinary legal scholar from India, when he talks about rightlessness, and when he talks about putting human suffering at the center of what we think about when we think about human rights. This is globalized structural violence and state violence, which is directly correlated with the various impacts of the phenomena that I've highlighted here. What this flows from is an underlying understanding that the migrant flows we're talking about at the US-Mexico border, in Europe, here, in Asia, what they involve is an analysis of root causes, which leads us to the following conclusion. Wherever there is a denial of the right to dignified conditions of life in a home, country, or community, the migration that results is forced migration. This is not, quote, voluntary migration. This is to try and deconstruct and break down and critique the traditional differentiation that's made between so-called economically motivated migration, which is theoretically voluntary, and other forms of migration which are involuntary, which then trigger rights as to refuge, asylum, international protection, and so on. What we're saying is no. Forced migration cuts across both, and so in effect, that triggers duties both on the states of origin, on states of transit, and on states of destination. Under such circumstances, there should not be either a differentiation, which is very common within the framework of international humanitarian law, between migrants and displaced people. Internal displacement is always the first step towards international displacement. And so they have to be understood as interlocking processes. And it's forced displacement that begins in Colombia, in Guatemala, in Mexico, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Sudan, in Myanmar. In all of those contexts, it can be empirically shown that the relationship is one of flow, is one of integrality, is one of an interrelationship. And the law needs to recognize that. So when we talk about the root causes of forced migration, what do we talk about ultimately in Latin America? Of course, the ultimate source, the ultimate cause of forced migration in Latin America is US policy itself, is US intervention itself. So just like the EU which produced the conditions which result in forced migration from Africa and the Middle East and from its interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere, along with the US, it's the US and its interventions and the policies it imposes, so-called free trade, for example, in Latin America, that produce forced migration. So it's primarily the result of US policies that have exacerbated violence, poverty, food insecurity, climate change, and essentially the way we describe it in immigrant communities in the US is, we are here because you are there. And we, those migrant communities, are the products of your policy. And so this is your responsibility. It's not just a theoretical north-south responsibility. It's specifically, what about the EU and its colonial legacy in Africa and in the Middle East and elsewhere? And what about the US and its neo-colonial legacy in terms of Latin America? So peoples and movement, I'm not going to have time to get into the case studies, but these are just case studies that we could look at. In our region of the world, the Tampa affair, some of you might recall, which is what began the policy of Australia devolving these mechanisms of interception and of detention to Nauru and Manus Island and so on, intercepting the flow of migrants seeking asylum in the immediate wake of 9/11, by the way, of Afghanistan and Iraq soon. The case of Behrouz Bouchani, I don't know how many are familiar with him. He's the migrant writer who was in the Manus camp for 6 years and wrote about his experiences and is now in exile in Australia. We've seen the images at the Poland-Belarus border. We can talk about that later. It's also true at the borders between Israel and Palestine. I won't burden us with that now. The English Channel. Let's just ask the question, how many migrants have died where in the world, and where do they most die? The numbers at the US-Mexico border are terrible, but the worst numbers are at the doorway of Europe itself, which to me raises the following question. What do we mean by European values? European values, that's what we hear about, and that's what the commissioners of the EU talk about when they're questioned about these issues. This is an extraordinary report that came out in the New Yorker, the journal in the US, just 2 weeks ago, about the secret prisons I was alluding to in Libya. Here you have a description about how the EU equips and trains the Libyan Coast Guard, sabotages humanitarian rescue operations, and captures migrants. The migrants are then detained indefinitely in a network of profit-making prisons run by militias. This is Libya today, as we speak. In September 2021, about 6,000 migrants were being held, many of them at this camp called Al-Mabani. Let's remember that name, Al-Mabani. International agencies have documented what? an array of abuses, detainees tortured with electric shocks, children raped by guards, families extorted for ransom, men and women sold into forced labor. And then as the former Minister of Justice of Libya says, the EU did something they carefully considered and planned for many years. Quote, to create a hellhole in Libya with the idea of deterring people from heading to Europe. Sound familiar? Prevention to deterrence? So this is with the tax dollars of EU citizens, no? European values in practice. Then we have case studies that, again, I'm not going to have the time to share with you about what's specifically going on at the borders of the US with Mexico and with Latin America. I've shared with some of you in my classes about what's going on with Haitians specifically. We have just had in the US between mid-September and early November, the largest mass deportation in US history of any specific group since 1954. Over 10,000 Haitians expelled from the US and through cooperation agreements from countries in the Caribbean returned to what everybody recognizes throughout the world as impossible conditions of life in Haiti as we speak. This is the Biden administration, not the Trump administration, which is not to take the Trump administration off the hook, but it's to stress that the most important thing from the perspective of the rights of these groups is continuity between Trump and Biden, not change. We also have all of the ways in which neighboring countries are being used through externalization and regionalization as gatekeepers to prevent irregular migrants from coming. This is the movement of what's known as migrant caravans. We can talk about that later, but I just want you to see a quick image. I don't know if we can turn to this link, Guatemalan Repression of Caravan. If we can just open up that link quickly. If you can see this, these are the images of the Guatemalan military and security forces repressing the migrant caravan on Guatemalan territory in January 2021, the day Joe Biden was inaugurated as president in the US. These security forces in Guatemala are armed, trained, and financed by the US. If we can open up that, maybe a full screen? Yeah, sure, thank you. This might be reminiscent for the images you've seen, for example, of Poland and Belarus as well, or the Israel-Palestine border as well. I mean, it's throughout the world. This is the same Guatemalan military that's been found guilty in national and international courts of genocide against the indigenous peoples who are primarily the migrants who are marching.
Y les pedimos de por favor que los manden comidita pues porque tenemos niños, llevan hambre, llevan frío, no tenemos nada y como nuestro gobierno no los oye, tal vez el hermano de El Salvador los brinda la ayuda, los echa la mano pues.
So again, this is in January of 2021. Thank you. Let me just go back to the PowerPoint. I probably have, what, 5 minutes left? I don't know. How is our time? Oh, sure. Great. Thank you. Sorry. Why don't we open up the next link too, really quickly? If we go back, sorry. Indigenous migrants, just again to underline who these migrants are, just literally a minute.
They're dying at the border. You hear that Central Americans are dying at the border, but you don't hear that these are indigenous children dying at the border.
At the U.S. southern border, people from Guatemala make up the largest portion of unaccompanied minors and family units apprehended. At least 6 young children have died in U.S. immigration custody. 5 of those children are indigenous Mayas from Guatemala. And if we include adults, 6 Guatemalan Mayas total have died at the U.S. border.
You can stop there.
The news reports from the Guatemalans.
But I just wanted you to see the faces, the photographs. Jacqueline and Felipe are among those photos. Also a young woman named Patricia Gomez Gonzalez, who was 17 years old and was shot to death by the Border Patrol at the border in June of 2019. Patricia Gomez-Gonzalez, her case is still in impunity, sadly, and also the cases of Jacqueline and Felipe that we remember today. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. The border of the US increasingly is no longer the border of the US that we see when we look it up on a map. The border of the US is increasingly wherever the migrant flows are, and that's the process of externalization and of regionalization. It's extended as far as my home country, which is Colombia, at the southern extreme of Central America, sort of the entry point, the transition point between South America and Central America. It's the border between Colombia and Panama that's known as the Darien Gap. You can look that up. But I mean, specifically there at this moment, on Colombian territory, you have 20,000 Haitians who are being prevented from moving north. That is through US financing, training, encouragement, and support, in cooperation, in that case, with the Colombian government. So that's what we're talking about, just like in Libya, just like in Turkey. In Latin America, what we decided back in 1984, when there was a major crisis about Central American migration, it was kind of the origins of the current crisis, we ended up approving a redefinition of refugee status that was an expanded definition that goes beyond the Refugee Convention of 51 and the Protocol of 67. What essentially it argues, this is what's known as the Cartagena Declaration of 1984, is that the definition or concept of a refugee that should be used should include among refugees persons who have fled their country because their lives, safety, or freedom have been threatened by generalized violence, foreign aggression, internal conflicts, massive violation of human rights, or other circumstances which have seriously disturbed public order. That was in 1984. That is essentially what Latin American countries have begun to legislate in contexts like Ecuador and its new constitution, but it has not yet been adopted internationally. But it's a sense of the direction in which we need to go. So when we talk about migrant genocide and transitional justice, we're being concrete and we're not being rhetorical. What we're talking about is more than 45,000 deaths globally of migrants since 2014, 75,000 globally since 1996, plus deaths in custody or due to the use of force, COVID, etc. All of this can be found on these websites. This is the website, this is the Missing Migrants Project, not of some radical leftist or migrant social movement, but of the International Organization for Migration, which is the official UN agency now for these issues. It's on their website at the Missing Migrants Project. But it's also in the work of NGOs and social movements like this group called United Against Refugee Deaths in the EU. You can find similar data, and you can even find daily data as to the European Union and as to the US-Mexico border about the number of deaths. What are the deaths like? What dimensions do they have? For example, at the US-Mexico border, over 8,000 deaths between 98 and 2021. This year, set the current record. It's the highest number of deaths at the border ever, 557, which is up from 300 in 2019. What do you have in Mexico? In Mexico, what you have, which is where the asylum seekers are being exiled to, right? To this kind of violence. You have a report from the UN based on the visit that was just completed on November 28th, 4 days ago, of the UN's Committee on Enforced Disappearances, a 12-day visit, which resulted in a conclusion that's here shared on the UN website of the Office of the High Commissioner, Michelle Bachelet. 95,000 disappeared, which is the global record. It's the record in the world for the number of disappearances, 95,000. 52,000 unidentified bodies, and what the UN, which normally speaks diplomatically in these kinds of contexts, described as persistent structural impunity. That is the place to which migrants are being sent to be safe, to be protected. In addition to that, you have a specific report that was also presented during the last 10 days in Mexico by Mexico's own National Human Rights Commission. Again, these aren't activists. This is not civil society. This is a state institution, independent of the executive, that's called the National Human Rights Commission, that issued a report documenting 70,000 migrants who've been trafficked or kidnapped since 2011. And the kidnapping should be defined as forced disappearances because they involve state complicity, if we look carefully at the Convention on Enforced Disappearances. What else awaits them on Mexican territory? There have been 5 massacres of migrants on Mexican territory since 2010, with over 300 total victims. This is what the Biden administration calls protecting migrants, sending them to these conditions. So, how do we get to genocide and how do we get to transitional justice? We are talking about migrants who have been targeted for state violence and structural violence because of their status and identity as migrants. In addition to their citizenship, their nationality, their national origin, their race, their ethnicity, their religion, their language, their gender, their age, their disability, their LGBTQ identity, etc., all of which are relevant when we talk about a social group for purposes of genocide law. But in this case, we're saying they're being targeted because they're migrants. They may be migrant women, they may be migrant children, but they are being targeted because of their migrant status. So what we're saying is they are victims of mass indefinite detention in inhumane conditions, such as those that produce the death of the indigenous children I invoked at the beginning, under conditions of torture and forced disappearances, as we've heard described in Libya or at the US border, the forced separation of families, which Professor Chen referred to at the beginning. All of these constituted minimum crimes against humanity pursuant to Article 7 of the Rome Statute, and all of these are of a potentially genocidal character. This is what the Biden administration is doing. As I reminded you, this is just a statement that I issued today with other colleagues. What we're talking about ultimately then is transitional justice is not a gift, and transitional justice is not a privilege. Transitional justice is not a policy. Transitional justice is a right. Transitional justice is a state duty which grows out of states' responsibilities to, quote, this is the core doctrine of international human rights, to respect, protect, fulfill, prevent, investigate, and remedy human rights violations. Transitional justice is not a gift. It's not a concession. It's a right and it's an obligation. Serious human rights violations thus trigger duties of transitional justice. Rights to truth, to memory, to justice, to reparations, which can be both individual and collective, material and symbolic, and to guarantees of non-repetition. All of this is reflected in the UN principles and that I highlight here, but also in a very recent compendium, we don't need to open it up now, which the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has developed on these issues. The Latin American region, sadly, I say because it's meant a lot of suffering, is the leading region in the world on transitional justice, and so the compendium is an important referent, not just for courts and advocates in Latin America, but globally, because of the dialogue that I know the professor is involved with. All of this is ultimately grounded in what we refer to in Latin America as the system of 500 years. The system of 500 years. And so all of this, when we talk about migrants as the subjects of transitional justice and of mass human rights crimes, what we're talking about ultimately is the task is to decolonize human rights, to decolonize international law, and to decolonize, to complete the decolonization of the international system. As Walter Benjamin reminded us, and as the phrase that I alluded to about European values reminded us, every document of civilization is a document of barbarism, and that's the nature of global migration policy today. So when we talk about global migration and we place indigenous peoples, for example, at the center, we're talking about the framework that we've tried to develop, which we define as human rights from below. Human rights from below. We're talking about the relationship between peoples and movement, decolonization, and transitional justice. There's all kinds of questions about epistemology and methodology that we can talk about in the questions. We're talking about the idea of borders as a method. We're talking about the analogies between Pateman's work on the sexual contract and Charles Mills's work on the racial contract, and essentially what we're talking about is a migrant contract. The way in which the denial of rights to migrants creates a system that is sustained through that exclusion. Just as the sexual contract does, just as the racial contract does. This is what Cristina Beltran, a leading scholar, defines as cruelty as citizenship. In other words, the price of citizenship in Western liberal ideology is exclusion. In this case of migrants, just as it has been of women and of racial minorities. This is just some maps to situate us. We can skip over all that. Skipped. And borders as sites of struggles and reflection. What is a border? A border is a wall, it's a bridge, it's a window, and it's a mirror. It's a wall because it's what we're up against. It's what divides us, but it's also a bridge. A border is a window. It's a space that enables us to see things that we would otherwise miss. It's a mirror because a border is a space that reflects who we are and what it says about us. A border is a prophetic space, literally and metaphorically. It provides us a glimpse into the future. And it means that what we do is we put the marginal at the center and we make what is visible invisible. This is what the right to have rights is all about. This is what the ultimate task and the ultimate framing that we need is the decolonization of sovereignty, of borders, and of nation states. All rights for all without borders. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Peréz-Bustillo. I really like your metaphors at the end, which reminds me of someone once said that how a country or nation treat others speaks volumes about that country. And I think that's what we see in your presentation, not only a country, but also a region or a regional unit like EU. And I'm sure that we all learned a lot from the presentation, not only about the reality, the law and policy, the theory, the philosophy of migration and transitional justice. We also witnessed Professor Peréz-Bustillo's passion on this issue as an activist and an engaged scholar. And now we will hear from Eeling, Executive Director of Amnesty International, 国际特赦组织董事长Eeling. She will speak about refugee rights in Taiwan, and Eeling has been deeply involved in the advocacy of refugee rights, including the drafting of the Refugee Act, which we do not have a chance to discuss it in the legislature. So let's welcome Eeling.
Thank you, Professor Chen, and thank you everyone for having me here. And I think under the global threat to the migrants and refugees, I think Taiwan faced a similar backlash from the Chen, and due to the Taiwan's special international status and also not a member of UN, I think Taiwan faced some different obstacles on these issues. Where is the... Okay. Yeah, so, as you know, that Taiwan enjoyed a very good image on the human rights in this region, such as the recent year the legalization of same-sex marriage, and also we we always have a very high ranking on the freedom of press, and also like the civic space. Usually we have a very good reputation on this. However, I think that's also because why some asylum seekers fly to Taiwan, and they may not understand why this country didn't have a domestic refugee law or any protection mechanism here. And this picture is just a lesbian from Uganda, and she got an interview by a radio station in Taiwan and talk about her story. And she already overstayed here many years, and until now she cannot get any legal status because lack of the mechanism. And also due to the COVID-19, now she even cannot go to another third country to seek asylum, like in other countries. And yeah, the basic information about Taiwan, I think, we are not a member of UN, we are not a state party of the Refugee Convention, we don't have any UNHCR office here, we don't have domestic refugee law. But we have 5 UN Human Rights Convention, which already become our domestic law. So they are ICCPR, ICSCR, CEDAW, CRC, and CRPDO. And what I heard is that CAT is going to be the next one. I'm not sure, but maybe. So hope so. So there are some legal binding, I would say so, if I can, because they are our domestic law. So like the Article 7 in ICCPR, and also the General Comment 20 about the Article 7 is all about the against torture and the non-violent principles about refugees. So and also in the 2 ICCPR and ICSCR review, the human rights experts give the in their concluding observation, they also ask the Taiwanese government to pass the refugee law and also add the non-refoulement in our immigration law. But until now we don't have a bill yet, and we don't have any non-refoulement principle in our immigration act. And this is a picture about the refugee camp in Honghu Island. It's a small island near besides Taiwan. And yeah, so even though we are not a UN member and we don't have domestic law, but actually we do receive some both refugees from Vietnam, Laos. These countries is about 6,000 in 90s. So we do have some practice in the past, although they are using like a more like a military control or way to deal with these refugees. But at least they get the legal status in Taiwan. But after that, we didn't have any kind of project or mechanism like this. Maybe the Hong Kong one is another special project. Yeah. So what do we have in our domestic law? Actually, I didn't put any slide about the draft of the refugee bill in my slide. But maybe I can also briefly talk about the draft. The first draft actually is submitted by the DP party in 2005. And after, so that's the first time the DPP get the ruling regime. But we didn't pass the bill because at that time KMT is still the majority party in the parliament. But when KMT get the ruling regime again, on 2009, actually KMT submitted the bill again. So both the 2 biggest political parties all submit the bill in the parliament in the past, but until now, now it's 2021, this draft didn't pass in the parliament yet. And in 2016, actually this draft was passed the first reading. So actually you can find the article of the draft on the website. And yeah, so there are some, I would say, some progressive definitions about refugees on this field, such as they include the climate refugees in the definition of the refugee. So that's the very very progressive definition in the field. And also they include the war, people flee away because of war. So I think that's also a broader range in the traditional refugee definition. But yeah, in the bill it still says that this bill only apply to the foreigners and or stateless. So when we talk about who is foreigner, usually they will go to some kind of political sensitive issues about is that the asylum seeker from China or Hong Kong, are they foreigners? So that's why this bill usually has, I don't know, so it's just stuck in the parliament for a decade. And also, I heard that the professor mentioned about like the safe third country. Actually, in that bill, it's also excludes people who come or transfer to another safe third country. Then that could be excluded from our help. So that's maybe the not good part in that draft. Yeah, so that's our, I think there are some, in my previous job, Taiwan Association for Human Rights also submit NGO comments about that draft. So if you all have interest, you can find our NGO's comments on the website. So what do we have in our domestic level? Actually, in the Organization Act of our National Immigration Agency, it's very funny. They do have an article and an item said that they have the duty to determine the status of potential refugee and handling the matters relating to refugee and asylum and sheltering. So there is an article, but actually in practice there is no clear procedure, and we don't have any application form. You cannot find any application form on the immigration agency's website, and when you arrive in the airport, no one will tell you how to go through the process if you want to seek asylum. So, and even when you seek out from the NGOs, and when NGOs send the official document to the immigration agency, then what we get response will usually that the NIA will say, oh, sorry, because we don't have a domestic law, so blah, blah, blah. That's all. And it's also another interesting article in our Employment Service Act, which is Article 51. It's also very interesting because this law is regulates the working visa of the foreigners. And usually there are a lot of regulations, such as if you are a white collar foreigner, you want to get a working visa, you should have a very high salary, like about 67,000 Taiwanese dollars per month. It should be higher than that. So, but in the Article 51, it says that if you are a refugee permitted to stay in Republic of China, which means Taiwan, and then you can get a working permit in Taiwan and accept the all kind of regulations in other articles in that act. So, but who will be the refugee permitted by the authorities? Actually, because there is no procedure, so it's very funny we have this article in our domestic law. And also we have another article in our Immigration Act, which is mainly deal with the exiled Tibetans. It says that if you are a stateless people from India or Nepal, and you enter Taiwan before this timing, then And also, if you get reviewed by our Mongolia and Tibetan committee, then you can get permission to stay. So that's another very special mechanism to deal with the exiled Tibetan. So you will see that there is a sunset article there. So if you come after that, sorry, you are not you are not fit in this article. So you have to fight for your rights again and again. And Professor Vivianne said that the white collar working visa is the monthly salary should be above 1,730 US dollars. Okay. Yeah. So you will see that how the Mongolia and Tibetan committee could do the refugee review procedure is also another interesting issue. That what kind of definition what kind of standards are they using? It's not transparent, and maybe it's not follow the UN convention. So that's our current situation. So that's the picture of the exiled Tibetans, the protest in front of the immigration agency, and said because they are come after the sunset finding. So usually you will say that every 3 years there are some other cases come out and they go surrender and say, oh, we already been overstayed for more than a decade. We want to be legalized. Okay, another article is in another special law governing the relations between people in Taiwan area and mainland area. Mainland area means China, means not the ROC, the PRC China. Yeah. So this article, they do have a special item says that the Ministry of Interior can permit a special case-by-case long-term residency to the people from China out of the political consideration. But what is the political consideration? You have to see another Article 18 in the regulations which regulate the people from China if they want to get a long-term residency in Taiwan. There are some conditions, like if you are helpful for our national securities, or if you are helpful for our international image, something like your contribution to our country. Yeah. So, and I think the last one is the most related to the asylum issues. It's about if you are a leader of a democratic movement and you have a very extraordinary contribution on that, and you also face the prosecution, and you have an immediately dangerous, then you can get a special permission by this article. So, but who will do this review and what kind, how to define who is the leadership and have a very good contribution on the democratic system. Still, there is not a very clear procedure for this whole process. So that's the one for the Chinese asylum seekers. And these two is the two Chinese asylum seekers. Actually, they flee from Thailand, from Bangkok, and they already get the UNHCR refugee card, waiting for a resettlement to another third country. But they think they are not safe in Bangkok, so they choose to fly to Taiwan and then stop in our airport for 100 days. And because they don't have the insurance permission, they don't have a visa. So the government just keep them in the airport for many days. But after that, I heard that there is one NGO that sent these two guys like a invitation and said that they want to do some exchange or visiting, then they get the entrance visa. So they come in to Taiwan and then wait for the resettlement to another country. Yeah, so you still can see that a lot of this mechanism and procedure, even though they already got the UNHCR refugee card, but it seems like when they arrive, actually the immigration agency officer even told me that maybe the UNHCR card is a fake one. So how can we identify or check whether the card is real? And yeah, so actually this part is also provide assistance from the NGO part. We send an email to the UNHCR office in Thailand and say, can you confirm these two guys are there, they are in your database? Yeah, but this kind of thing is, well, I do understand that maybe the Taiwanese government is still afraid that maybe the UNHCR office won't give any official response if the request is sent by our government, not the NGO. So, but they still can cooperate with the NGO and do this kind of double check. I think that's still some ways can be done. Okay, so and the other article is about the Hong Kongers. There is Article 18 in the law and the regulations regarding Hong Kong and Macau. And it also said that the necessary assistance should be provided to Hong Kong or Macau residents whose safety and liberty are imminently threatened for political reasons. So I think this article is also kind of related to the asylum issues. But again, there's still no procedure, no clear mechanism on that. So how to define or how to, who will decide that you will fit this situation? Is there any committee will do this review? And do we have any, if you get rejected, then do you have any appeal opportunity? Actually, there's nothing saying about that, so that's the problem. And this is the Hong Kongers in the MRT station during the elections, and they are very worried about Taiwan, and also saying that Taiwan, please do your right voting. Yeah, so you see that they're very, even though they didn't get their legal status here, but they still worry about our election. So that's a very interesting image, yeah, for me. So without the clear application procedure here, I will say that all of the asylum seekers in Taiwan will be easily become victims of human trafficking or human smuggling. Because if they want to, like the Excel Tibetans or the Hong Kongers, usually when they want to enter Taiwan, how can they go? Usually they will pay a huge amount of money. Sometimes they will buy a fake passport, or they will hire a boat or something like that, and then try to help someone can provide them assistance and to get the entrance here. But yeah, so usually they are, sometimes they will be they didn't get their destiny maybe in the end, but they still pay a huge amount of money. Or when they find that they are using a fake passport, then they still caught by the immigration officers and maybe get deported. So that's still a problem. And also, yeah, even when you enter Taiwan, then because we don't have a refugee visa, so if you want to stay here, usually you still have to find another way to get a long-term residency. Like you need to find a university to give you a student visa, or you have to find a job to get a working visa, or maybe you're rich, so you can become an investment migrant, or you just find a Taiwanese and get married. That's maybe another solution, but maybe not easy. Especially when you are LGBTI, and there are still some countries that are not, even their same-sex marriage is still not recognized by the Taiwanese government, because if your home country is not recognized same-sex marriage. Yeah, so without this domestic law and the clear procedure, usually the non-refoulement becomes like a mercy, even by the ruling party, and you don't have another way to, or remedy to, when you get rejected. Yeah, so I would say that's the problem. And that's the cases about the Kurdish people who are from Syria. This kind of cases happened in Taiwan twice. One is in 2016, and the other one is in 2019. Yeah. And because they are using a fake passport, so they called by the immigration officer, and then immediately they just prosecuted by our prosecutor, and because we are using the word, yeah, and then they just served in jail for the sentence. After that, they get deported. So even our government said that they didn't deport any asylum seekers or refugees, but actually they do. and but in this case, our government said they didn't deport them back to Syria. They just deport them back to the last destination, like when they are transferred from Malaysia. So they just, our government just deport them to Malaysia. So, yeah, so the immigration agency said, oh, we are not,
It's not a deportation.
yeah, it's not.
They're willing to leave anyway.
Break the non-refoulement principle. And if you go through the Article 63 in our Immigration Act, it's all about, is there any special situation that you can, won't be deported. But in these articles, actually, there are no exceptions for asylum seekers. There is a review committee in the immigration agency, but usually the cases they review is for the migrant spouse or migrant workers. So usually they already get a long-term residency here. When they get deportation, they can appeal, and they will go. This committee will review their case and see if there is any reasonable part in this deportation, so they can do some appeal and remedies through this committee. But for the asylum seekers, usually they are using a tourist visa or even illegal entrance. So there is no way for them to get way to the deportation. Yeah, so there are many cases in Taiwan now, like the people from Turkey. We know some of the students, they already studied in Taiwan for many years, but when the groups happens in Turkey 2 years ago, their passport, when they want to renew their passport in their embassies here, they will get a cancellation by the Turkish office here because the Turkish government assumed that all the overseas Turkish people are related to the opposite party and so they also want to seek help from Chinese government, but at the end they get the same answer because there is no domestic law. So many of them, even though they are PhD students or even they are very good business men or women in Taiwan, but they cannot get a legal status because we don't have refugee law. So many of them just seek asylum in other third country before their visa gets expired. Also, there are some Tigray students here. Now the war in Ethiopia and the conflict is very serious, and there are more than 10 cases about the Tigray people in Taiwan, but they are also facing a similar situation. No procedure, no way for their there is no special project like Hong Kongers. So I don't know how their case will go on. And the only way, if you are a foreigner, the only way you can get a long-term residency here, you can go through the Article 23 in our Immigration Act. Is again, you have to marry to a Taiwanese, or you have to. So it's similar. Actually, the only way you can stay here is just like the other ordinary people. Just find a job, just become an investment migrant, or just marry a Taiwanese. That's all. No other options. Yeah, I think my time is 5 minutes. Okay, but I think I already finished all of my presentation. So until now, the NGOs in Taiwan still advocate the Chinese government to pass a law, but we still hear some objection from the civil society or from the government, and there are some reasons we heard. One is about the national security issues. So some people say that if we pass the refugee law, so maybe the Chinese government will use this mechanism to send a lot of Chinese asylum seekers to take over Taiwan. Yeah, but if you see our draft of the refugee law, actually the first definition is foreigner. So, and who is the foreigner in Taiwan? Actually, Chinese asylum seeker, according to our constitution, they are not foreigners. So actually, even we passed the bill, the Chinese asylum seekers or the Hong Kongers, actually they still cannot they still cannot use the bill. If they want to get the refugee status, actually we have to revise another law, which we saw in the beginning, the other two different. One is the law of regulation. Maybe, but I think this law is quite clear. Maybe we just need some detailed procedure about how to implement that. And the other law is that the act governing the relationship between people in Taiwan and China. Yeah. So, but yeah, national security is still a big obstacle and issue when we talk about the refugee bill. And I think the other reason why people object is some people will say, oh, we worry about our working opportunity will be taken over by the refugees. Yeah, but maybe we can see that the number of our migrant workers every year, actually we import a lot of migrant workers every year. So, yeah, it's kind of like we are lack of human resource rather than we are don't have the job opportunity. So yeah, I think that's the two major reason I have heard when people they say that Taiwan should not have a refugee law. But is that the true reason for that? I'm not sure. Yeah. Okay, so I think my time is done. Thank you.
Many thanks for this presentation, which gives us a very clear picture of the state of refugee rights in Taiwan. Taiwan is very proud of its achievement in democracy, but we should really be ashamed of our record on refugee rights. So now let's turn to our last discussant, Professor Weng. She's an expert in international human rights law.
Okay, good.
Okay, please.
Alternative. Okay, thank you, Camilo. Thank you, Professor Chen and Eeling. Okay, old friends. We have several times almost like fighting together against the National Immigration Agency, against all their excuses. Like this difficulty, this administrative power limits, etc., etc., etc. But we all know that that's not the core of the problem. Okay, good. So my purpose here would be, Professor Camilo has led us to the border, the U.S.-Mexico border, the EU borders, to take a look at the situations, and it could be a picture like, well, it's the end of the world. It's like so far away from us. In Taiwan, we don't have such a problem. So that's my purpose. I'm going to tell you that we're proud of that. We're exactly proud of that. We have also this border control, this immigration policy, very conservative immigration policy, and this non-compliance to this non-refoulement principle. Okay, so I've done a very simple slide. Okay, let's come back to this central idea of border control, this border patrol, border control. It's not working well, right? Okay, I know this. That's why these young guys now giving up. They are giving up their AirPods, going back to the traditional white one. Yeah, I would do the same, you know. Okay, good. So this border control, this concept is actually very young. It's only developed through 20th century. It's young and it's born with a myth, a historical myth, a very famous myth called white slave trade. What's white slave? White slave means that at the end of 19th century, you only talk about the slaves like black. Only black would be slaves. No white slaves. Okay, we are human beings, we cannot be slaves. But what about these white slaves? Okay, the myth was like this. An unknown international criminal organization, a huge one, an evil one, is forcing our young girls in Europe. They are kidnapping these young girls and force them into those markets in the new continent to be prostitutes. Okay, stories like this, telling you that these bad guys are kidnapping our girls and force them into the sex industry, which was considered as very notorious thing, and that was in an atmosphere where the nobles or the middle class were trying to purify the society. Okay, our society should work hard, to concentrate on good things, to believe in God, things like that. Okay, good. So this myth, why this myth? It's to tell you that you should take care of your border.
You should close your border. You should watch these guys coming here and there. So before that, they didn't put such attention on those guys, foreigners coming in and out. Okay? So after that, they create this myth, the Europeans, and then the Americans. So they did this just to reinforce this idea of border control, to participate in this fight for what? For population control, for better protection of for national and economic social conditions that they had created on their own. We are proud of our socio-economic situations here, and we are proud of this social welfare system. We will protect it against those foreigners coming, just like the French always say that, coming to eat our bread. Okay. Okay, so more control over the population for health, for example, the biopolitics talk about that, and the wealth that we create. And they don't mention that we create this wealth and health on the basis of our colonizations, of our imperialist behaviors around the world. They didn't talk about that. Okay, so more control over the population, that we're successful, and it means that in the meantime we'll create our control over immigration. We and you. Okay, the wall is built. Okay, the paradox is that human migration is so often motivated by economic and social conditions. So I can hardly survive here, so I have to move. I move somewhere else to find a better pastoral, to find better climate conditions for my herd, etc. So there's such a need, but there's no such right to asylum or right to enter or stay in any country in international law. So that's why Camilo told us that the decolonization of international is necessary to debug this problem. Why? Because international law now tells you that you don't have the right to asylum. You don't have the right to enter and stay in any country that you wish. Okay, a foreigner coming to knock the door at the airport, asking to enter Taiwan, will ask for what? For visa? For permits? Are you from the US? Yes, welcome. So you're from Namibia? Sorry, do you have visa? Where are you coming here? Etc. etc. Okay. So now be pragmatic. How do we strike a balance between these national interest calculation and our individual interest? If we cannot reach this decolonization right away, decolonization of international law, supported by this border control and white slave trade myth, telling you that there's a huge network of international, transnational criminal organizations trafficking with women and children all around the world. Telling you that these evil guys are messing up our lives and they are smuggling human beings. But is this really human smuggling? Okay, so next. Let's look at Taiwan. We have domesticated, core human rights instruments like ICCPR on civil and political rights, and another covenant on economic, social, and cultural rights, and this CEDAW on women, CRC on children, CRPD on people with disabilities. Okay, so these last three, why we have more, just like Camilo showed us that We have #1 CRC on children, ratified by almost every country in the world. And see though, okay, you'll be surprised. Do we that feminist in this world? No. And why would they ratify everyone this CEDAW convention? Simply, I'll tell you that that's something very patriarchal, because they think that we proud men, we can protect women and children. No problem at all. They will not threaten our existence. But civil and political rights, no thank you. No thank you. Convention against torture, no thank you. We don't do that, but we don't ratify that. Because that will give those opportunists to ruin our society, to break the rules, to create problems, okay? So, let's say that, we also have this ICER, the Convention Against Racial Discrimination. We have ratified it before we get kicked out the UN. It's still valid, so we are getting ready to implement that, and we are getting ready to domesticate also cats and cats optional protocol, okay? Which means that all these instruments related to foreigners' rights will be binding on Taiwan, because we put them as part of our domestic law. Okay, it's part of our domestic law. So, about aliens' rights, Professor Li in Tsinghua University has written a lot about the foreigners' rights protection in Taiwan and the problem of this non-compliance with ICCPR. Okay, including what? Including those asylum seekers, including those foreign workers, including those migrant workers. Okay, so let's come back to this problem, essential problem that Taiwan used as major excuse, saying that anyway, there's no international consensus on equal protection of aliens' rights, which is true actually. Which is true because this principle of sovereignty, the primary reason for this resistance, okay? So, which means that there will be no international human rights instruments to generally guarantee aliens' rights to equality, always with some conditions. If you got the ARC means aliens residence certificate, okay? ARC, without ARC, with ARC, if you are get married, if you are investors, a lot of different categorization saying that I'm not doing anything with discrimination. It's just an organization of our society. Okay, so prohibition of discrimination based on what? Based on this time, nationality. Oh, sorry. Under Article 2 of ICCPR and ICER, okay, and under Paragraph 2 of the preamble of ICER, you find nothing saying that we prohibit discrimination based on nationality, but only based on national origin or race. So these countries will celebrate. Hey, look at this, okay? It's not awful, everyone do that, okay? Everyone does that. So, difference in treatment based on nationality means that it's acceptable if you are not sovereign states to protect your national interest, you can do that, okay? And secondly, they create another category saying that you're documented immigrant and undocumented immigrant. They don't use undocumented. We use that. We know that they are only undocumented, but every state, almost every state in this world will tell the people that they are illegal immigrants. Why using this illegal? Just like Camilo told us, like Eeling showed us that we want you to believe that they are dangerous. They will be a threat to our national security. They will force Chinese asylum seekers to invade Taiwan. Okay? So, we create this term, illegal immigrants, to tell you that these guys will be a great threat to our existence. Just like this white slave trade telling you that they are evil smugglers, trafficking people, smuggling people everywhere, and trying to ruin our social order, trying to ruin our economies, etc. Okay? So, illegal. So this principle of sovereignty still prevails regarding this residency permit, and once this entry or residency permit is granted, difference in treatment remains possible. Why? Because you don't ban us from creating any difference in treatment based on nationality. It's for our national interest. You cannot create any international rules telling me that I cannot have considerations based on national interest. And Taiwan. In Taiwan, we create creative, we create another categorization of for these documented, even documented immigrants, white collar and blue collar. Just like Eeling has invoked, we blue collar immigrants has no rights to family reunion, which is the minimum requirement in the Convention of Migrant Workers, right? We are not immediately ratifying that convention because the Ministry of Labor told us that we might have a lot of reservations on that. We never had a single reservation on those conventions that we have ratified. This time, the Ministry of Labor, we might have a lot of reservation on that. And I guess that one of the reservations would touch the what's that called? The object of the convention is, for example, this right to family reunion and to permanent residency or naturalization at the end. Impossible for them. You want to get naturalized in Taiwan, turn yourself into an investor. No way for them to become us. So why? That's the question we should ask. These are recyclable immigrants. Recyclable and illegal. Remember what you've heard all the time on the news, telling you that there's a runaway migrant workers somewhere, hidden somewhere, very dangerous to the society, creating those, having guessed like if these are criminals. But what have they done? They have worked. They have done those jobs, unwanted jobs, by Taiwanese, unwanted jobs. For example, I've heard a story just from the immigration office telling me that in those recycling factory, the processing factory, okay, and there are 3 basements. At the very bottom of the basement is very heated because you have to select those metals, okay, unwanted jobs by any Taiwanese. The boss say that I will pay like 2,000 NT dollars a day for this job. No Taiwanese answer to that job announced. So he had to seek to migrant workers, but he was like kind of unable to finish that whole procedure all along. he wants to save money, he wants to lower the cost, and he didn't want to start the procedure to cope with those brokers and paying them for the service, etc. So he hired some, what we call the runaway migrant workers for that. Working very well, they love each other very, very much, and when the 6 migrant workers get caught, undocumented, get caught, finally, this boss cried and said that I will send all the money to your family, don't worry. And if you want to come back, I will apply that for them, for you, to make you legal next time. Imagine that. That's what those criminals have done to Taiwan. To help you to maintain the recycling processing factories from being collapsed, for example. Okay, so let's say this myth still from the end of 19th century to today, we are still using this myth, telling you that foreigners are dangerous. Only white collars are not dangerous. They will contribute to our economy. And we forget that in Taiwan, indigenous people have helped this country to build railroads, to build a city, this city of Taipei. And next, migrant workers have helped build the railroad, the highway, the buildings, the Taipei 101. And we are still telling you that these migrant workers, especially those runaway guys, they are dangerous. Okay? So this undocumented, not illegal, actually this terminology is to maintain this myth. But what's really dangerous, we should pay attention to this underground status of these, what we call the runaway or undocumented migrant workers, is the great risk, the real risk of contemporary forms of slavery. Because they are not protected by law, they are outlawed. These outlaws, they are not protected by any laws. So imagine that this factory boss for recycling, he was nice. But imagine that what if this guy was an evil one? Okay? So a lot of stories goes in opposite way. Okay. Next, the minimum requirement. If we don't criticize the immigration policies, immigration settings, let's say that there's at least a minimum request is your obligations under Article 7 of the ICCPR and Article 3 of the CAT Convention is the principle of non-refoulement. Okay, as Eeling told us, nothing happened really. Only some single projects on single cases, and just because the legislators are struggling on this possibility to open the door to the Hong Kongers, to the Chinese, to the Tibetans. Just that, nothing else. And those asylum seekers at the door of the airport asking to enter Taiwan, actually we don't have to worry about that. Taiwan would never be the top destination for these asylum seekers. It's just one stop. They will move to other countries. Imagine that someone from Africa, how would he dream of coming to Taiwan? Okay, except he has family members here, right? So, nothing to be worried about. And this resistance from the government comes actually from this unwillingness. It's not that they're unable to do that, because we got these norms, existing norms, and we got this administrative power to create measures, let's say administrative measures to implement these treaties, but they refuse to do so. Okay, so I will not tell you that, okay, we are not able to do that because we don't have this refugee law. Refugee law is just one tool to force these administrators to do something. Because we cannot use other means to force them to do something. Okay? So, something to do with Taiwan, yes, and I want to, at the end, I want to remind everyone and remind myself also that this island is built by immigrants. This country, this state, a nation of immigrants. Immigrants that have colonized this island without asking for any permissions from the indigenous people, without even a serious kind of reconciliation with indigenous peoples. And now it's time for us to think it over again. So how can we, the old immigrants, now trying to resist new immigrants when we still need labor power, we still need a lot of different contributions from these new migrants? And when will be the time for a change? So that will be my comments today, and thank you all for your brilliant contributions to this seminar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Weng, for shedding light on another dark side of Taiwan's human rights record and debunk the myth of national security. So now we would like to open to the floor, and I would like to ask our participants to identify your name and affiliation before you speak, so that our speakers would know who to respond. So any question from the floor?
Thank you, Professor Bustillo, Professor Chiu, and Professor Weng for this great speech. I am Szu-Chieh, a student at National Taiwan University and a student in the Department of Law, my first year. And my question I would like to direct to Professor Bustillo mainly, as well as other professors. In regards to your speech, you mentioned about this reconstruction of the so-called willingness of the economic motivated migrants, and the hinting of the underlying forces that because they are in a very dire situation in their country, and this situation is created by powerful countries such as the United States or European countries. Therefore, it is the aforementioned countries' duty to, it is their responsibility to accept and expand whether it's asylum or acceptance of immigrants. And also this idea of rethinking border as whether it's a militarization or perhaps a more open idea to on the international level. But my question is, under this framework, what do Professor Bustillo as well as other professors propose to handle this surge of immigrants that is sure to appear at the border of the United States as well as European countries? Take the perfect example of UK. Last year and about 2 years prior, they have accepted a large amount of immigrants, and this has caused I would say, a pretty heavy resistance from a public level and from a governmental level to namely the cultural impact as well as the economic impacts on these large acceptance of immigrants. So under this framework of rethinking and reconstructing this idea of immigrants and this open border across on an international level, what you propose is a possible solution or a policies to perhaps cushion the impact that is sure to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chen from National Taiwan University, Department of Law.
Hello, and thank you for such a distinguished panel. I learned a lot. I'm a student from National Taiwan University. I'm a graduate student from International Division, and I have a question to Professor Camilo about your argument of the immigrant genocide. And my question is, how do you overcome the legal threshold in the Genocide Convention, Article 2, because this article requires at least three requirements. First is of course the genocidal actions, and the second is the intent to destroy a group, and the third is that the group has to be based upon the ethnicity or nationality or race or religion. And I think, well, about immigrant genocide, how do you recognize immigrant as a, I think an immigrant can qualify as a status, but can you frame immigrant into a group of specific ethnicity, religion, or nationality? This is my first question. And also, if you want to prove the intention to destroy, I think even in the most extreme case, we can only prove that, even in the U.S.-Mexico border case, we can only prove that there is a strong intent to expel or displace, or even use extreme brutality as a means, not ends. So how do you overcome the basic legal threshold in Genocide Convention, Article 2?
Thank you. I think we can allow one more question before we end the first round of Q&A. So now I see two hands. So how about we let the two friends speak? So I think I see that one first. So please go ahead and then.
Okay. Thank you. My question is, I read a lot about this movement in Northern America that is about sanctuary cities that refuse to basically apply the regulation in terms of immigration law and to send immigrants back. And so I was wondering what you were thinking about it, and if it had a future, if this kind of initiatives would be maybe a solution, or if we have to think at a bigger level and think about an international instrument, and in that case, what could it be?
Thank you. Please.
Hi, thank you so much for this really extraordinary presentation to all the presenters. My name is Michelle Flo, and I'm a visiting professor at NTU College of Law, and was an immigrants' rights lawyer in the United States and worked on a lot of documentary rights issues. So I guess I have a question that maybe is not suited for a student at the College of Law, but we know that in the United States, for instance, with LGBTQ movement, that the law changed alongside public opinion, that there's such an incredible shift in public attitudes towards gay people, that is why the judges had to go with the times, to such a point that the Supreme Court reversed its view, within the span of 2 decades. And that involved commercials and TV and media and stories of gay couples who had been together for 50 years and kids coming out to their parents. And I guess my question is, what is the equivalent for us, for lawyers thinking about how to work with the people and with storytellers? Like, this is a really powerful slide. How do we convert this into a story for people to think about ourselves as immigrants? And I'm curious about that both for Taiwan. In the US, we saw that a little bit. I totally agree with a professor about the continuity between Biden and Trump. But there was a moment of public outcry against family separation at the border. You saw that everybody was thinking about it, to the point where people were like, yes, you can yell at a public official at a restaurant. You can cross that line of civility. So I guess how do we create that kind of public pressure, that kind of storytelling? And we know that the runaway migrant worker is not dangerous, but how do we portray them as somebody of value and worth who has a family? And what are the strategies there that you see? And I'm sure, okay, I'm going to shut up. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we have many questions directed to Camilo. So can you go first, and then we will Professor Fu and Eeling respond.
First, I feel really privileged to be with my colleagues and to learn from them and from the questions that have been posed. I want to try to think about a little bit the relationship between the questions, especially I think the first question and the last, I think in some ways converge, because there's clearly a problem with public opinion, let's say, to say the least. So what you were describing about the UK, and exacerbated now, of course, by what's going on in Calais and in the Channel. You know, I think it's interesting. It was actually totally coincidence, but I was in Germany in the summer of 2015, in Berlin, when the doors were open, so to speak. And I was really, I mean, I think Germany is a unique context, positive and negative in many ways, and many of you know Germany much better than I. It's the only time I've spent time there. I was at an academic conference for something else, but it was obviously relevant to my interests. And so I just started walking and listening and watching what was going on in Berlin particularly, but in Germany more generally. We were at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and so we heard like some of the high-level officials in Germany who were talking about this problem of negative public opinion, so to speak, and how to address it. It's also sort of a transitional justice story, because a lot of the impetus, I think, from Merkel, also because she grew up in the GDR, and you know, there's a lot of specific circumstances there that led her to make the decision she left. And it's, of course, you know, she just left office, so it's very relevant right now. I was struck that there was a unique combination of circumstances on the ground in Germany that made it possible for there to be at least that momentary shift. Now, it didn't last very long, and there was a big backlash, and she paid a heavy price, and the ruling party paid a heavy price, et cetera, et cetera. But I think there are lessons there worth looking at about what was that sort of chemical combination of ingredients that made that possible. Also, Michelle, and I'm so glad that we're connected here. I mean, you know, I experienced that period of family separation at the border. I was working at the border in El Paso. And El Paso was like, it was called Ground Zero, in fact, by Trump and so on. That's how it was targeted. And it really was a targeting. And it was interesting how the criminalization of migrants and everything that produced family separation and made family separation kind of conceivable as a policy, because it was a policy, was also about targeting border communities and criminalizing border communities. So we experienced that because, you know, I was living and working at the border. So it's the flip side kind of this problem of public opinion and so on. I mean, I think the bottom line is this. All of these policies, at one end or the other, have costs. The only question is which costs we legitimize and assume as acceptable, right? So for example, there was a live debate, you know, a true debate in the EU Parliament in Germany when all this was going on in the summer of 2015, and in the US with family separation, let's say, the opposite extreme. That was about, for example, literally, some might know Katie Hopkins, who's a media personality in the UK, who was very loud on these issues, kind of like Zemmour in France, sort of. And basically what she said was, let them die, let them sink. Don't rescue them in the Mediterranean. I mean, not only don't let them in, let them die, literally. She said the words that she used was they're cockroaches. And we just, this is, of course, the words that were used in the genocide in Rwanda, right? Migrants are cockroaches, let them die, let them sink. There was a serious debate in the EU Parliament about whether there should be rescues or not. So somehow those costs were assumed as valid because of who the question is, do you value the lives or not that are at stake? As people say, there's always lives in the balance, right, in public policy. It's only a question about which lives you value. It's like what happened at the US Supreme Court yesterday and, you know, a month ago about the issue of reproductive rights. Are women's lives truly being valued or not? And what's the price when you don't? I mean, of course, there's so much attention given to the life of the fetus and so little attention being given to the life of the woman, you know? So again, there are always going to be costs. And so there has to be a way of making those costs visible and explicit And then you decide which way you go, right? Of course there is a cost, a burden, if you open the doors. What's the cost if you don't? And which costs matter? No, which lives matter? I mean, Black Lives Matter, etc. I mean, the way we put it is kind of, until Black lives matter, migrant lives won't matter. It's all intertwined. Until women's lives matter, our lives won't matter, etc., etc. To see ourselves in that. And I think basically, sometimes things like this should not be put to a vote. Like reproductive rights, for example. Because I don't think a woman's right to choose can be validly determined by the, quote, majoritarian democratic process. I don't think so. I think there are certain things that are rights, and sorry, they have to be respected. No, I mean, there's ultimately that's where we go. And so I think when it's an issue of the duty that former colonial powers or current neo-colonial powers like the US have to their victims, that's not subject to a vote. Yes, whatever we can do to improve the climate in public opinion and to tell the stories, that's crucial. But there are people like Katie Hopkins or like Eric Zemmour who basically think migrants are not persons, they are threats. You know, Zemmour talked about this as the candidate for president in France. He talked about immigration is war, right? And immigration is invasion. And of course, this is essentially what Trump was saying, a little bit more subtly, but not much. And so there's a lot of that out there. And so that means a price in human lives. It means it's okay to separate families. It means, I mean, when I heard that in Taiwan, you could not change your job without permission, I was like, what? And again, all my respects to Taiwan and its democratic experience and practice, but it was like, hold on, can we just like step back for a moment and think about this? Again, what our colleagues have reminded us, which is even Taiwan, which is so democratic compared to so many other places in the world, this is still a blind spot, so to speak. And what explains that? And I think we heard some suggestions. Anyway, I mean, we have to talk about this for hours and probably a whole semester and a seminar. I can't lay out here the full case of genocide, but what I would say is this, is that I think if there's anything that's clear, is that the law of genocide has evolved just as the law as to human rights in general has evolved. Like, think about reproductive rights. Think about marriage equality. I mean, think about racial equality for that matter, right? In other words, where were we 50, 60, 70 years ago in terms of the assumptions about each of those, and where are we now? So there's clearly that it is possible, and this is go back to Michelle's question, it is possible to shift consciousness and conscience. How do you do it? As to genocide itself, and actually Lemkin, when he thought about genocide much more expansively, we know, this is in his writing, than ended up being in the Genocide Convention. And that's why since then, the jurisprudence of genocide, the case law of genocide, in international courts, in regional courts, and in national courts has evolved to look at genocide not narrowly, but more broadly. And so that's why in Latin America, within the framework of transitional justice, we talk about genocide in terms of social groups targeted and victims of political persecution. And that includes genocide. No? And so that's not what the Genocide Convention says. We know it left out political persecution for political reasons. But we also know that that was an error, no? And that error is being corrected. So, and the other thing is, for example, the fact that the Rwanda genocide was handled as genocide was itself a huge step. Because there you did not have the narrow differentiated groups that you were alluding to. And again, it's not the only exception. Guatemala, Peru, in terms of indigenous people, and so on. So anyway, I don't want to linger too much, but I would frame it that way. Sanctuary cities, I mean, what Anna said is just super important. what we say is we need sanctuary states, sanctuary countries. In Latin America, we talk about a sanctuary continent. That's why I underline, maybe I didn't explain it enough, when Ecuador legislated in the Constitution the right to migrate, they included not just refuge and asylum, but also right to sanctuary. They used the word sanctuary. It's the only constitution in the world that I know of that does that. So I think that's suggestive of what we need to do. Now, of course, sanctuary cities generated a terrible backlash, and what Trump tried to do is punish sanctuary jurisdictions, and that became a huge issue, and it became a legal issue. Now, of course, under Biden, it's a different climate. But bottom line, again, what Biden is still doing is closing the door and criminalizing. So I think a sanctuary response is still needed, and it has to be on the ground. And it has to be carefully rooted in public opinion in those jurisdictions and communities where it arises. I don't know if I covered everything, but
Okay, just a few words on the. I don't know if we do have an immediate solution, but in the long term, that's why we got the SDG under the UN framework about poverty. This inequality, this world inequality, they talk about that like state to state inequality, but actually it's inequality between these peoples around the world, people within the state, even we get these inequalities between them. So the priority is that the world should really work together to find a way to at least we can move on toward that direction, how to eradicate these kind of inequalities, at least take a step forward. So why they move, why they run the risk, because they cannot survive in their hometown, that's all. The most dangerous route from Afghanistan through those deserts, those frozen mountains, and to Europe, for example. Why take all these long to Europe? Because it's impossible for them to stay in Afghanistan. So my answer will be that make the world more livable first. And then we can find the way, temporary way, like in Taiwan, should we rethink, once again, the legal channels for immigration? Isn't it too narrow? Because international mobility has a price. And if they are too poor to survive in their hometown, how can they afford this kind of international mobility? So at least Taiwan, these industrial countries, toward those blue collars, can you be a bit more friendly? Just a bit more friendly. And then respect the principle of non-refoulement. That would be my temporary answers. Okay, so I'll pass the floor to Eeling.
Thank you. I think when we call them a burden, I think maybe we need to switch our thought and think about if they get a job, they will pay tax to our country. Actually, they can do a lot of contribution to the country. So, when we talk about refugee, like my first image is the one genius person is Einstein. What we call Einstein a burden. He is a refugee when he visits United States, and he's a Jewish scholar. So, but now when Germany stopped the massacre to the Jewish people, then he became a refugee in the United States. Is Einstein a burden for you? And every year now, I'm not sure if you are watching the Olympic Games. Now, every year that, not every year, I'm not sure how many years they will. 4 years, sorry. I'm not the fan of the sport.
Winter one again every 2 years.
Okay. Yeah, but the recent Olympic Games, there is a team called the Refugee team. And actually there are there are some swimming, ethnics. They are from like Serie or from other countries which are their countries are in war or armed conflict, and they flee away. And although they are refugees, but they have their own experts, their talent and experts. So they are not burdened. They only become a burden when there are only a few countries want to take the responsibility to the non-refoulement principle and obligations. So if there are only one or two countries opening the border, then I think that something will happen because the mass of the migrants waiting for the check of the identity or something like that. So that will become an issue. But if more and more countries take the responsibility and work together, because refugee issues should be international cooperation. No one single country can do it by itself. So if it's only Taiwan open the border, then of course we will face trouble. But even we don't pass the law, actually there are also asylum seeker camps. So we just leave them, live in limbo. That's all. They won't stop coming because we didn't pass the law. That's the fact. So just face the reality, and we need a mechanism to do something on these cases, especially those who are already in our country. And for the cultural impact issue, I think there are many countries that do a great job to help the refugees and asylum seekers to do a better integration in the new country. So like Germany or even Canada, they'll do a lot of job to provide the language courses or culture courses to the refugee children or migrants for them. I think that's important, not only to legalize, but also provide some extra help, help them to get involved to the society. That will be easier for them to live with us. That's my opinion. And for the story telling, the strategy, actually, there are some. There is a book called the 国际上的漂流者 Exiles on Borders. It's published by the Taiwan Association for Human Rights and the Legal Aid Foundation. It's talk about the stories of refugees and stateless people in Taiwan. You can buy it online, and it's in Chinese and English. So that's all done by the NGOs. Even the Amnesty International also do some YouTube film to record the LGBTI refugees who come from Uganda to use a very short time to talk about what she faced in Taiwan, and also the Turkey cases. Even this year, June 20, we also work with the KOL, some influencers on internet to talk about the refugee issues in Taiwan, like the Fan Xifei or some other person. So that's what we thought, and we will be done. So we will keep doing that, and hope one day Taiwan can pass this or build up a mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you. We are so fortunate to have a wonderful combination of speakers, activists, and scholars. And I would like to echo our colleague Michelle for the necessity to use storytelling, because feminism, critical race theory, has been using this method to change the world, and I think that that's what social rights group has been doing in Taiwan, and we need to keep doing that. So I would like to conclude our forum now, and we are supposed to have a third forum on a different topic, and we will announce it as time. as time. So please join me to thank our speakers for today, and thank you so much for attending this forum.
The third forum will be about the indigenous people, the right of indigenous people. We just organized the next forum, maybe working together with the Donghua University. Yes, also next year. Yeah. So welcome.
Yeah, with Donghua University, Donghua 大学的原住民族学院。
College.